right? So those are things to keep in mind when you're doing that. When it comes to doing new wood projects, if you're building any kind of furniture or anything like this, or if you're building some cabinets like the boxes that are here, or anything like that, usually the best thing you could do to learn about finishing is to do finishing, right? So it's like, how many guys out here that run a saw, run a lathe, do any kind of routering? The first thing we always do is we take the saw, we set it up, or the router or whatever, and we go to the scrap box and we grab a piece of scrap and we push it through, right? When it comes to finishing, everybody waits till their project's done, opens up a can of stain or finish, and just hopes. Hope that they did the right thing, hope that they're going to get the results they want, hope they don't have to burn it in the fireplace because it didn't turn out as they will. The first and foremost thing you want to do when you want to learn about finishing, the first thing to do is when you have your first piece of scrap from a project, take that piece of scrap and actually create a finish on that surface. You want to go through the process that you normally would go through. You go through your sanding, prepping the surface, then you go through your stain, your finish, whatever you're putting any conditioning products on there, whatever you're going to do, go through it on that scrap piece. It's really easy to throw this away. It's really tough when you commit yourself to a piece of furniture and you get the results you don't want. And what you're going to do is have to try to recreate something there. So always take that opportunity to take a piece of scrap and actually try your finishing out on there. It'll educate you on exactly how everything works, and you know the results you're going to get before you get there. And it's going to take all the mystery out of it, take all the surprise out of it. You should end up with something that looks as good as your sample piece does. One of those things that I always find that when I'm doing this, I'll take a piece of scrap like so. If I know, I'm building cabinets, for example, like something like that, and I may be using a brad nailer, I might be taking the opportunity to use a little bit of stainable filler in that cabinet to fill in those brad nail holes. Take your sample board like so, pop a couple holes into it, fill it with your stainable filler, sand it off, see how it performs for you, see what your results are going to be before you actually commit it to your project. It really is an easy way to tell you exactly what you're going to end up with. Now, when I come to sanding, preparing everything to take a stain or take a finish on here, there's two kinds of sanding methods. There's your quarter sheet, your palm sanders, all your different orbital sanders, and your power sanders, right? Those are meant for, as what I call a shaper, and they actually shape the wood a little bit. When you're sanding a piece of wood to prepare it to take stain or take finish, you should be down to hand sanding method. What you want to do is get down to the point, once you shaped it to where you've built the piece got it to the shape you want it to be, then at that point you start with a hand sanding method. You take a coarse paper, you hand sand across the surface. You're not trying to shape it, you're just trying to open up the pores, right? Sand with your coarse paper, then go to your medium, and then go to your fine. When you finish up sanding, if it's a softwood, you should end up with about a 180 to 220 grit paper is where your fine sanding should be. If it's a hardwood, about a 150 to 180 grit is where you want to be. What this is going to do is going to open up the pores and allow the wood to take the penetrating stains and penetrating products into the wood. That'll let your tongue oils go in there. It'll let your oil-based stains, your water-based stains, anything bond with the wood itself. So that's really what you want to do. With the stainable filler, on this piece here, I've actually put a number of holes in here, and I'm going to pass this around, but just make sure that I get it back at the end of the night, please, because this is one of those things that you really don't need to take home with you. It's not really going to be anything but firewood to somebody. But what I've done here is I've actually shown with a couple holes here and then with a bit of stainable filler filled in, and then you can actually see spots, if you look really close into the stain part of it, where the stainable filler is. But it looks like a very fine pin knot almost when you look at it. And what I want you to take a notice of is when you put that stainable filler in there and sand it off, you shouldn't have a big ring around the stainable filler. Some fillers you maybe have tried over the years, the thing you find is you usually end up with a big ring around where the filler is. The filler didn't take color, or it became somewhat of an issue keeping the product in good shape in the container. So over the years, I've probably thrown away more filler than I ever used because of those reasons, right? It didn't work, it dried out inside the can or whatever. So we came along and built a stainable filler that actually works. And the reason this one actually works is it's made with real wood flour. So it has little particles of sawdust right in there, and it will take the stain the way wood will. It'll work with water-based, oil-based, interior, exterior. So if you're doing any staining on wood, this is a good little tool to work with. And we do sell in a very small container as well, a 29 milliliter size. For those guys that don't make many mistakes, this is the size I use. But the nice thing about that package, that tube there, I've had it on the go for about 9 months, and it's still, I can open it up and pull product out of there and still in good shape and still works well. So just fill in your void, sand it off with your shaper, with your pound sander, whatever, then hit it with your hand sanding. That really takes and opens up the pores and makes the stain, the surface ready for to take your finishes. Now, when it comes to putting stain on and that type of thing, again, this is one of those areas where it's going to tell you what you're doing, if you're doing the right thing or not. With this one here, on this side of the board here, I have a section without conditioner, and on this side with conditioner. So if you look at this, you can probably see that this is a little bit more shaded over here in some areas, a little bit uneven as far as the color penetration goes. With this side, it's uniformed it out a lot more. So by doing this, what this is telling me here, this is educating me as I'm doing this piece, it's saying that if I use a conditioner, this is the results I'm going to get. If I don't, this is what I'm going to get. Which one do you want? That's going to tell you the story right there, right? It's going to show you the example of with or without a conditioner and what your color is going to look like. What usually happens with me is once I go through this whole process and come down to putting the stain on, to putting the conditioner on, and putting my finish coat on, usually at this point, when I've got to this stage of my project, and I've got my sample piece done, and you notice my samples are big enough that you can actually see what the finish is going to look like. I take this piece of finish and I take it into the house. And I ask my wife, is this the color we want?
Good move.
I'll tell you, the we is implied. I really don't have a say, but I like to go in there and think that I'm part of the process. By doing that, what this does for you, because working in the shop, your lighting can be so much different than what it is in the house or where that project's going to end up. It can look so much different. Color can be affected so much by lighting. And everybody's eye takes color a little bit differently. So to avoid arguments and avoid disappointments later of a project that didn't turn out for you, go through the process. Put your conditioner on, put your stain on it, put your top coat on it. Look at where it's going to end up, and that's going to tell you whether you've got the right process going on. Yes?
Do you put conditioner on all wood?
Depending, again, on what I'm working with. If I'm staining, 95% of the time I'll use a conditioner. And there is a reason. For some of the soft woods, it will help uniform stain penetration. Uniforms gets rid of a lot of the blotchiness to it and give you a better appearance. If you go into species like oak, for example, oak has a tendency now today to give you a lot of bleed back. If you take and put a penetrating stain into it, it'll take that stain deep down in, and then about 4 or 5 hours later, it'll push it back out, and you'll get these little dots in the grain usually happening. Conditioner will help avoid a lot of that. It'll fill up the pores to help take the stain at an even level, and it gets rid of a lot of that. So there's very few times that I find a conditioner isn't beneficial to me, but again, it's one of those things you have to, there's certain rare species that I find that I won't use a conditioner on just because I'm trying to get a more intense color into it, or I'm trying to get, I know that I'm not going to have a blotching problem or anything like that. But most of the time you'll find it is beneficial. If you're working with water-based stains, always use a conditioner. The conditioner works a little bit differently with a water-based. We're not talking oil-based like this. Your penetrating oil-based conditioner goes into the wood, and what it does is it fills up the pores to help take the stain at an even level. So if you think of it in a scenario of building a house, And this is kind of your footing. What this does is levels the ground. When you put your stain on it, it's like the wall. When you put your top coat on, it's like the roof. If this is missing off the bottom, what you're going to do is have a sag in that wall, right? And so it's going to show in the finish on the top. So that's what the conditioner does for you. It creates a barrier, it creates a base. Sometimes I find the conditioner has a lot more properties to it than most people realize. If you're working on something, you may be looking at a piece of wood that you're storing for a little while because you want to let it season a little longer or anything like that. I find that if I take a bit of conditioner and brush on to the wood surface and let it take whatever it needs and just let it, once it takes whatever it needs within that 5 to 15 minutes that's recommended on it, take and wipe off the excess and just let it sit for a while. What this will do is kind of seal off the wood, but it'll slow down the drying process so it doesn't, you're not so liable to see cracking and that happening on it. So it really can help you stabilize the wood moisture content in the wood and slow down the drying cycle a little bit so that it doesn't dry too fast and split the wood. So it's a really good way to keep in mind for if you got some blanks or something you want to store for a bit. Yes?
Yeah, using alkaline dyes. Would you put that on? Water-based or water-based sealer? Or?
You could put that on and you could seal off a piece and then once that's dry, then you could put an alkaline dye over top of it. It would take it, but you would have to just give it a light sanding first just to make sure the pores are open today. But that's really it. This is just going to feed the wood a little bit for you. You know, sometimes with alkaline dyes and that, it just sits on the surface and really doesn't nourish the wood too much for you. This will help help that stability and keep the moisture content level in the wood itself, right? If you're working on a lot of veneers or different species of wood that have a lot of texture to them, you might find instead of using a conditioner, a sanding sealer is a good way to go. What a sanding sealer does for you is similar in properties to the conditioner. What it does is create a uniform place to build your films off of it, but it will inhibit the penetration of stain. So if you're using a sanding sealer, usually it's meant to go just below your polyurethane. So sometimes you'll find that people will say, well, gee, I want to try to get that mirror finish, that mirror smooth film on there, and you're working on oaks or something that's a little bit porous. You can come along, put your stain on there, put the sanding sealer over top of that, and it will actually, you can sand it, put a barrier on there and kind of build it up a little bit, and then put your film over top of it and get a smoother finish to the surface. So that's where sanding sealers are meant to do. And with this particular sanding sealer, it is a water-based version, but it works with all our polyurethanes, whether they're oil-based or water-based. And it's for a polyurethane-based sanding sealer. It's not for a varnish sanding sealer. It is a polyurethane-based one. So it'll stand up for that film. With the sanding sealer, you put a coat on, give it about an hour, sand it off with 320 grit paper, then you can go ahead and put your film over top of it at that point. With the sanding sealer, if you're using it over top of stain, and this is something that it doesn't talk about it too much on the can at all, or in any of the information you're probably going to see, but I know everybody's wants to get that smoother finish, will try it, use a sanding sealer. The only thing you have to be careful is that when you sand your sanding sealer, you don't go through it, right? Because it's very thin. If you sand through too much, you're going to sand into your color if you're putting a stain underneath it, right? But it is compatible with all our oil-based and water-based products, so it's not an issue there. Water-based stains and conditioners. Anybody have any questions on the oil-based stuff? Everybody, I don't even have to show this can because everybody's probably got one of these in their shop, right? How many of you guys have read this side of the can? Oh, I got a few. Good. One of the important things is, yes?
Who's got 20/20 plus eyesight?
Right here. They sell them in the store.
Can you read the polyurethane?
That's a little different because of the colored. But one of the things it does tell you about on the stain can is that it's recommended to put the second coat of stain on it. The first coat really will give you the volume of the color, And what the second coat will do for you is actually fill up the pores so that when you start putting your top coats on, you're getting a much more uniform appearance on the surface. A lot of times people will say, well, you know, I put this coat of stain on there, I got the color I want. The next day they come back to it and they start putting their polyurethane over top of it, right? They're brushing on their polyurethane, and all of a sudden they see a spot in the center of the table that doesn't look like it's taken any polyurethane. It just seems to be no build of finish on there. Well, where that finish is going is deep into the pores of the wood, because the first coat of stain and the only coat of stain they put on, it sits in the pores of the wood. After about 4 to 6 hours, it will have gone down as far as it's going to go. That's why we recommend putting that second coat of stain on it. What that's going to do is top up that coat of stain so that when you start putting your top coats on, you get that uniform build on the surface. So that second coat of stain really is not going to add a lot of color, but it really will fill up the pores to take that top coat evenly. Yes?
Does that work? Like I've done that with just one coat of stain and then put polyurethane, and I noticed I got what we call it flashing.
Yeah.
And that's what it is. If not, I should have put a second coat of stain.
Yeah, that's it. By putting that second coat of stain on there, what it does is, because the wood is more porous in some areas than others, it'll pull it down, right? So it's pulling that stain down into it, and sometimes it takes a little longer than others. So we recommend that 4 to 6 hour period so that we know at that point it's gone as far as it's going to go. When you put that second coat on, it's just going to top it up and then allow you to put your film on the top of it, and you get that nice uniform build on it. You'll always find when it comes to putting the polyurethane on, if you have some kind of base underneath it, you'll always get a better build of your film on the surface, and you'll have to put less coats on as well. To stain, yes, it's always the 3 W's. Wipe it on, wait, and wipe it off. And the third one is the most important, because you don't want to leave a lot of excess stain on the surface either, right? I've seen a lot of people say, well, I want to make it darker, so I'm just going to leave that stain on there and I'll barely wipe it off, right? So then they come along and they try to put the polyurethane on there, and what happens is the solvents and the polyurethane react the stain and start moving it around. And all of a sudden you have film that's flaking off, or it's drying, or different things that will happen to it. And that's why it's always important to wipe off that excess amount of stain.
So
Yes,
that stain on that piece of wood there, that's just 2 coats on that.
that's correct, yeah. Yeah. So if you find that when you put your first coat of stain on there, or when you're doing your sample piece here, and you find you put that stain on there and it's not quite deep enough in color, and this happens, you know, you pull out a can of stain, maybe it's something in the shop, you're going to try to use it up, you pull it out, it's not quite deep enough. Well, with our stains, they're all base compatible, so you can take 2 different colors and create another color out of that by just taking and mixing them together. Usually what I suggest doing is doing something using a very simple method: muffin tin, measuring spoons. Now you don't never want to take 2 full cans of stain and mix them together, because what you just done is spoil 2 cans of stain usually. So what you want to do is always take some way you can measure it off. Incremental formula, what you're creating here. Now don't get caught going in the kitchen and stealing the muffin tin and the measuring spoons, because you won't gain any friends there either. What I usually do is start off with a teaspoonful of the color, the base color that I'm working with, and then I'll add to that. And you always want to add darker to the light, right? You never want to try to lighten up a dark stain. You always want to darken a light stain. So the lighter color you put in first, and then you add to it. So if I use something like an espresso like this maybe, which is a fairly dark one, and I wanted to create even a darker tone with this, I would take that espresso and put a teaspoon into 3 compartments, and then maybe get something like our ebony stain, which is a black, and add a 1/4 teaspoon, a 1/2 teaspoon, a full teaspoon. Stir that up and take it on my sample piece, try it out, see what it looks like, see if I'm getting to the darker point of where I want to be. Now, if I said, for example, that I wanted the espresso color, but it's too dark, it's a little bit too intense for me, the way you can make a lighter version of that is by taking just the natural stain, which doesn't have a color in it at all. Put a teaspoonful of natural in 3 compartments, then a 1/4 teaspoon of espresso, a 1/2, and a full teaspoon, and you'll get 3 different formulas of that same color tone, so you can get lighter versions of it. That way, sometimes it's beneficial to understand that, because when you're working on a project, maybe you're working on something that has solids and veneers in the same project, and the solids will always take the color a little bit more drastically than a veneer because you haven't got as much penetration level. By being able to make up a couple different shades of that same formula, you can use it as a blending tool to create that color you want, right? To get the uniformity of color. Something to keep in mind, something to play around. You know, you can learn more about finishing from just scrap box in the shop and just kind of playing around with it. Sometimes it's a matter of you can take a couple of cans that you maybe had sitting in the shop, you didn't know what you bought them for, or obviously the project didn't happen, or it was the wrong color. Like